Ask Mixing with Mike, what is the best way to set levels when recording digital? Now, when you're recording digital, there's a couple of things that you have to consider about setting your levels. So when we work with a scale, we're talking about the DBFS scale. So if you see the scale that we're talking about here, you could see that there's a peak meter and the highest level is 0. Meaning that if you go beyond 0, then you go into digital clipping. Now, the digital clipping actually happens not internally inside the computer, but at the analog to digital conversion stage. In other words, the analog voltage goes beyond the ability of the converter to measure, and therefore it can only write the highest level, whatever that number is, and then it records that in as actually clipped information. Once it's inside the actual computer itself, when you record and you play it back, you actually don't see the clip on playback because it actually wrote the highest level that it could possibly write. If you then push that fader level up by half a dB or something, now it's clipping again, right? It's going over that digital over, and you would hear that at the analog conversion stage, so when you go from digital back to analog. So when you're recording, where do you set your levels? Now, to me, their magic point to me is -6, somewhere in here. And you can see where the meter goes from red or this sort of orange color to red on the FS meter. And this is why I kind of like this basic level. Now, when you're recording, it depends the level, and I'll get to the -6 thing again. The level that you're recording is dependent upon the program material that you're putting in. When I started working with VU meters, and VU meters were the engineer's mainstay, VU stands for volume unit. And it's an average. It's meant to give you an idea of what the overall average level is of something. So if you have a meter here that peaks at 0, or you see the level go up to 0, and you have it, it's like a cowbell or something. The peak signal, the actual peak itself, probably goes up about 20, 25 dB above that 0 and would be distorting like crazy, okay? But you would only see the level on the VU go up to 0 because it's not fast enough to register those transient peaks, and the sustain is not long enough to show you. So the average level shows at 0, but it's clipping like crazy. And on the peak meter, that would be way over. All right, if that makes sense. So percussive instruments that have sharp transients and less sustain will actually meter very low. So that cowbell might get recorded at like -10 or -15 on the VU meter, and it would be clipping on the peak meter over here. Conversely, if I had an instrument like a bass, which has a very soft transient generally, and a sustain, then the 0 reading would be a little more accurate. And if I had it 0, that would actually show up on the peak meter here at about -18, because that's sort of the standard calibration. So the way that a meter is calibrated, and the way most A to D converters professionally are calibrated, is that you take a 0 VU 1 kilohertz tone, which represents +4 dBV, which is 1.23 volts, right? So this is an exact measurement, an exact voltage. And the input level is calibrated so that the A to D gain stage registers through the converter at -18. Okay, so what you see with that bass is that bass at 0 on the analog console on the VU meter is only peaking at like -18 on the peak meter. And what is more bizarre is like if you have a snare drum, the snare drum may show -6 on a VU meter and be up around -3 or close to 0 on the peaking meter, because the transient is really sharp and popping through more accurately, if that makes sense. So where do you go? Okay, so usually I go somewhere in between. So with the bass, I don't want it really at -18. I want to bring my level up maybe closer to -12 or -10. That gives me plenty of headroom in terms of my analog stage, so I'm not distorting the analog components. Because if I bring that bass up to 0, coming in through A to D, the gain stage going into the A to D may be clipping, right, recording in. Whereas the percussive instrument, I want to bring the gain so that the actual peak register is maybe around -6 on average. Okay, so the average level would be lower. It may show on the VU meter at like -15 or -10, but that gives me enough headroom so if the next hit is a little bit harder, it's not going to clip. And that gets me in a good basic range. So Where do you set your levels? It depends on the type of instrument. If it's a percussive instrument with a sharp transient and a short sustain, you want the peaks to be around -6. If you have an instrument like a vocal or something like a bass or a guitar where the transient is more sustained and the transient isn't as sharp, you're probably going to be closer on average to around -10, and then maybe goes up a little higher, down a little lower. That gives you enough headroom once you get it into the computer that you're not, you have room to EQ, you have room to compress in the digital realm, and you're not overwhelming the system. Otherwise, what happens is if you record everything to the highest level possible, then what ends up happening is as soon as you start to process and mix, the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to have to pull the gain down by 8 dB just so you could start doing some work. So you want to set the levels so that you can leave that gain staging in so that you get the ability to work efficiently within the computer system. And also, if you end up going back into an analog console, you don't want to be overloading the analog components because that bass that's at 0 here, an analog bass sound, when you bring it back into an analog console, it's showing up on this VU meter at +18. It's showing up 18 dB too hot, which means you're going to have to set a gain stage down to compensate for that, right? So that difference is enormous and huge, right? So you want to be careful about setting your levels in that way. So that's the basic guideline. The more percussive, right, set your peaks at a higher, like -6-ish. Things that are more sustaining, that have less transient peaks, maybe closer to -10, -12, somewhere in that range. So you're giving yourself some good balance when you record in and give yourself plenty of room to mix and work with the audio files once you got them into the DAW. All right, that's our Ask Mixing with Mike question. And for what is the best way to set levels when recording digital?